against China add up to 145%.
Even as Donald Trump remains unrelenting in his stance against China, the latter has called for dialogue, urging the U.S. to meet it halfway in trade talks.
And I think he's going to want to get to a deal. I think that's going to happen. We'll get a phone call at some point. And
April 2nd, 2025 will forever be remembered as the day American industry was reborn. The
prices will go up in the short term. On Amazon, we'll probably increase the price by 10 to 20% at some point.
Tariffs are going to increase the price of toys for the consumer.
Almost all electronics that U.S. consumers like to buy are fabricated in China.
It's been hours since President Trump imposed the most aggressive economic strike of his presidency, a 145% tariff on all Chinese imports. It wasn't just a tax, it was a signal, a dare, a line in the sand. But what followed was silence. Trump is waiting for one thing, a phone call, not a negotiation, not a summit, just a signal from the other side that Beijing is ready to talk. That Xi Jinping, China's most powerful leader in decades, is willing to come to the table first. But in Beijing, the silence isn't confusion. It's policy. It's calculation. Because in Chinese political culture, being the first to call is a loss of face. And in this war, pride is currency. Meanwhile, global markets are bleeding. Supply chains are frozen. Inflation is creeping across continents. JP Morgan estimates this new wave of tariffs will cost US consumers over $860 billion. A silent tax hiding in every product on every shelf. And this is no longer a trade dispute. It's a psychological war, and the world is caught in the middle. So we have two leaders. One waiting by the phone, the other pretending it doesn't even ring. And in the background, a global system built over 50 years is beginning to crack. This isn't diplomacy. This is the beginning of a global economic reset. We thought trade would prevent war. What if trade is how war begins? The world didn't wait for a deal. It reacted. Within hours of the 145% tariff announcement, US markets tumbled. The S&P 500 plunged. Nasdaq lost over 4%. Consumers didn't see bombs falling, but they saw prices rising fast. Phones, laptops, toys, car parts, nearly everything touched by Chinese supply chains suddenly carried a premium. American retailers began quietly raising prices, wholesalers cancelled orders, and middle-class households, already strained by inflation, now face a second shockwave. Invisible, but painful. This isn't just sticker shock, it's a systemic tremor. JP Morgan called it a consumer-side tax bomb. Economists estimate the average American family will absorb over $1,200 in additional costs, without ever seeing a new tax law passed. Meanwhile, in China, the pain runs deep but different. Exporters in Guangdong and Jiangsu are watching contracts vanish. Textile manufacturers are halting production, and up to 20 million jobs tied to US-bound exports are now at risk. But Beijing isn't panicking, because they've seen this movie before. In fact, China has spent the past 6 years building what one analyst calls an economic bunker, diversifying exports, shifting factories to Southeast Asia, and boosting domestic consumption to weather precisely this kind of siege. But the ripple effects don't stop in Washington or Beijing. Vietnam, Malaysia, and Thailand, the very countries where Chinese factories relocated to bypass tariffs, are now under scrutiny. Some may become unintended casualties in a war they never asked to join. And across the Atlantic, the European Union is quietly bracing for impact, worried not about tariffs, but about becoming the world's next dumping ground for Chinese goods priced out of America. This isn't just a trade disruption, it's a rupture in the fabric of the global economy. And the longer the silence lasts, the louder the damage becomes. To understand how we got here, we need to rewind. Not to what was said, but to what wasn't. Just days before the tariff surge, Trump announced a 90-day tariff pause for over 80 countries. But China left out, deliberately. The message was clear: you're the problem, and you will blink first. This wasn't a glitch. It was strategy, pure madman theory, lifted from the Nixon playbook and sharpened for TikTok-era politics. Create chaos, escalate tension, and make your adversary believe you're willing to go further than anyone else. Trump's closest advisors framed it as calculated pressure, forced China into calling, into bending, into bargaining. But China didn't bend. Instead, it leaned into silence. No fiery speech from Xi, no emotional outburst from state media, just a quiet doubling down. A meme went viral in China showing Trump's signature red hat, but with a twist, MCGA, Make China Great Again. The restraint was deliberate, because from Beijing's point of view, the more unpredictable Trump becomes, the more predictable his isolation becomes. While Washington plays poker with tariffs, Beijing is playing Wei Qi, the Chinese strategy game of slow encirclement, not sudden attack. And right now, China's strategy is simple. Don't react to every move, let the US overplay its hand, then reshape the board on your own terms. This isn't about semiconductors, solar panels, or soybeans anymore. It's about face. To the outside world, it may look like Trump and Xi are stuck in a trade impasse. Trump sees himself as the dealmaker, the negotiator who made Xi smile at Mar-a-Lago over chocolate cake and handshake diplomacy. But that first-term goodwill turned sour fast. Trump has never forgiven what he sees as China's betrayal of the Phase 1 deal, the broken promises, the missed targets, the pandemic silence. This time he wants something bigger, more than a deal. He wants submission, and that's exactly what Xi can't give him. In China, the concept of mianzi, or face, governs every level of leadership. Calling first would mean Xi lost the psychological war. It would signal weakness not only to Trump, but to the entire Chinese political system, and to 1.4 billion citizens watching closely. That's why the silence isn't awkward. It's strategic. For Xi, endurance is the message. A refusal to yield, not because he believes Trump will back down, but because showing strength is more valuable than any temporary trade concession. In Washington, this might look like stubbornness. In Beijing, it looks like discipline. Two leaders, two systems, two worldviews that simply don't fit at the same table. When tariffs stop working, the real weapons come out. China may have matched Trump's 145% tariffs with its own 84%. But Beijing's most powerful tools aren't found in shipping containers. They're embedded in culture, supply chains, and perception. First came the movie ban. Beijing announced it would reduce the number of Hollywood films allowed in Chinese cinemas. A blow not just to US soft power, but to an entire industry that increasingly depends on China's audience for box office success. The message was clear. If Washington wants to weaponize trade, Beijing can weaponize attention. Then came the fentanyl threat. Trump has tied China to America's fentanyl crisis and used it to justify earlier tariffs. But now China is reportedly considering suspending cooperation on fentanyl enforcement altogether. It's a chilling reversal. The drug crisis that once fueled Trump's political rhetoric could become Beijing's leverage point. But the real panic is in the minerals, rare earth elements. The building blocks of tech, defense systems, and EVs are heavily sourced from China. While only a few have been restricted so far, Beijing has floated the nuclear option, banning exports altogether. The impact? America's supply chain would seize up within months. Even beyond minerals, the psychological campaign continues. Apple, Tesla, Starbucks, all have been placed under quiet regulatory scrutiny in China. Not banned, not sanctioned, just squeezed. Heavily. A signal to multinational CEOs. In this war, your company is your flag, and your flag determines your fate. And all the while, Chinese state media keeps the tone calm, focused, resilient. The strategy? Make American businesses and voters feel the cost, without saying a word. Trump's strategy was clear. Isolate China, force its hand, and rally the world behind an America-first economic order. But the world had other plans. Since returning to office, Trump has reignited trade conflicts not just with China, but with allies. Canada, Mexico, Japan, the European Union. Steel tariffs, car tariffs, a universal 10% import tax. And in the name of punishing unfair trade, America began punishing its own partnerships. Meanwhile, China did the opposite. In just the past few weeks, Beijing has hosted trade delegations from Spain, France, and Brazil. President Xi is preparing official visits to Vietnam, Malaysia, and Cambodia, not just to deepen ties, but to send a signal. China isn't backing away from the world. It's leaning in. The EU, initially outraged by China's trade surplus, is now taking a more pragmatic approach. Brussels has delayed its own retaliatory tariffs, and quietly, some European leaders are opening discussions on how to stabilize relations with Beijing, even as Washington turns up the heat. While Trump is redrawing borders with tariffs and threats, China is redrawing alliances with infrastructure deals, rare earth guarantees, and quiet diplomacy. And this is the irony. The president who sought to isolate China may be isolating the United States instead. For multinational companies, the message is becoming clearer. Long-term stability may not be found in Washington's policies, but in Beijing's predictability. This doesn't mean China is replacing the US, but it's no longer just playing defense. The global economic stage is shifting. And China, once the outsider, is now inviting the world in. For a moment, Washington thought it had the upper hand. US companies applauded, markets calmed, allies stayed quiet. But while America saw a victory, China had already moved the board. Apple's supply chain, still rooted in China. EV batteries, 87% depend on rare earths, mined, refined, and controlled by Beijing. The war was never in the headlines. It was in the contracts no one read. There are no more negotiations, no statements, no summits, just silence and consequences. The tariffs are in place. The retaliations are real. What's left is the fallout. And the world is beginning to change, not with a bang, but with a shift. Trade routes are realigning. Alliances are recalculating. Global companies are rethinking where they build, where they invest, and who they trust. This isn't a temporary disruption. It's the early stage of something much deeper, a decoupling. What we're watching isn't just a trade war. It's a reordering. Not because the system failed, but because two superpowers stopped believing in the same system. But what happens when trade becomes the weapon? What happens when the ties that kept the peace become the first to be cut? We used to believe that if China rose economically, it would become more like the West. Now Washington believes that was a trap. And Beijing believes it was a trick. And both sides are building walls, political, digital, industrial, to never be vulnerable again. This isn't just a trade war. This might be the moment the world resets. Drop a comment for more breaking news.